Okay? So we left off with spermatogenesis. And does everybody understand the differences between mitosis and meiosis? What are some of the major differences? After I undergo mitosis, what do I end up with? Two daughter cells that are what? Identical to the parent cell. And mainly what I'm talking about is what? Chromosomes, genetic material. So how many chromosomes do you have somatic cells have? 46 chromosomes. 23 what? Pairs. So you got one bit of information, and when we talk about heredity, we'll talk about these bits of information. When I say bits of information, I mean code, genetic code on DNA. So you have 46 pages to your book, okay, with information on those bits of DNA that are going to code for what? Who? Everything. Give me a specific. Proteins. Transcription, translation. It's your information to code for molecules. And what is the code located in? What specifically about the DNA is the code? Nucleotide sequence, the order of nucleotides. Everybody remember what that means? What's a nucleotide consist of? No amino acids. That's a nitrogenous base. So in DNA I have 4 different nitrogenous bases, correct? Adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, yes? And then I also have another nucleic acid that's going to help with the transcription and translation process. You're on the right track, but what's that nucleic acid called? It's going to help the DNA, it's going to help read the code, RNA. And the difference between DNA and RNA is one of the nitrogenous bases is uracil instead of thymine. And it's a single-stranded molecule versus a double-stranded molecule. Yes? So those bits of information is your code. And certain sequence in your DNA is going to code for certain proteins. I'll give you an example. Example. It's only 9:30. Eye color. That's an easy one for us all to relate to. There's several different proteins that you make that you are going to see as your eye color. And where do you get the information to make those proteins from? You get it from your parents, yes. They give you a sequence. Both of them give you a sequence, yes? So you get half of that information from your mother and half of that information from your father. And you have 2 bits of information to make your proteins. In eye color, yes. Not in everything. And it's not just sometimes one bit of information that codes for what you see. For example, skin color. Do you know how many bits of information you have for skin color? 6. So there's 3 different sequences on, or we call those sequences or bits of information alleles. You have 3 sets of them. 1 from your mother, 1 from your father. So you actually have 6 bits of information that give us our skin color. And that's why even just in this room we see such a huge variety in skin color. Because think of the combinations. Does anybody play Powerball? Megabucks? Come on, who doesn't play? That's the main retirement plan, isn't it? Oh, it's $1 a week. Come on. Or $2 a week if you're a little obsessed like I am. So, how many, there's 6 numbers there. What the heck? You should be winning really easily, right? No. So think about the combinations. I have 6 bits of information now. I'm going to get 3 from mother and 3 from father. So I'm going to have a wide variety of skin color in humans because of the fact that there's 6 bits of information that are going to determine what I look like as far as skin color goes. So we range from very dark to very light, and all of the combinations in between give us the wide variety of skin color we see in humans. Okay? So, again, we'll talk about that when we talk about heredity. So this is where I'm making those bits of information to pass on to my offspring. And again, it's going to be a combination of 2 organisms in sexually reproducing organisms. So from immature spermatogonium, how many sperm or spermatozoa is a male going to produce during the meiosis process? 4. So from that one immature cell through the process of meiosis, which is kind of a double mitosis without interphase in between. Does everybody understand that? We're going to end up with 4 reproductive cells, or gametes. And again, these reproductive cells are going to carry that information to another organism, combined with that information from that other organism to create a brand new organism during fertilization. So, is everybody good with the whole concept? Everybody understand that the maturation process for sperm involves the production of a flagella, involves the production of a neck or mid-piece region with lots of mitochondria, and then a head region which contains the genetic information. So how much genetic information for humans in their gametes? 23. Half the amount of information. And what else is real important in the head region of a sperm? Those enzymes in the head region, what do we call that little area in the head region that contains digestive enzymes for the sperm? It's called the acrosome. And that's going to come in handy during fertilization. During fertilization, that head region needs to go into the oocyte, the female's reproductive cells, the female's gametes, and genetic material will combine at that time to form a brand new cell with 46 chromosomes, which will eventually become a brand new what? A brand new individual. So, on page 1037, they talk about meiosis and spermatogenesis. And you should understand that process. Now, what causes these cells to mature? Exactly. So hormones, remember the regulators of cellular metabolism, are the things that are going to get these. What were those cells called again? Spermatogonium to start to mature into spermatozoa. So let's talk a little bit about hormone regulation. So who's involved in regulating the maturation process in the testes of the male for spermatogonia to spermatotid? Well, it all starts with this guy up here, well, kind of in the middle of that guy up there. Yep, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland itself. So anterior pituitary hormones, gonatotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which is going to stimulate the release of what? Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which is going to then go where? It's up in the head, but last time I checked, male's testes weren't there. And you can make all sorts of jokes on that one. I'm not going there. So what has to happen? Circulatory system then picks up those hormones. They hit their target cells where? Interstitial cells in the, or the sustenticular cells is the ones that actually are going to get affected. Where are we talking now? How about the testes? Yes? What other hormones are going to be involved in the maturation process? The big T, testosterone. And that is going to get the meiosis process going. So we see that when these targets are reached by these particular hormones, they are going to start the maturation process. Now, some of these hormones also have an effect on other things besides the maturation process in the spermatogonia or sustenticular cells. Any ideas what some of these hormones might also do? Have you ever heard of secondary sex characteristics? What are they? What are they for? Well, we're in males, so let's talk about male secondary sex characteristics. Deeper voice, more muscle mass. What's that doing for me? As a male, what's it do for you? Well, let's look at a female's view. What's it do for you? Listen, I was embarrassed on Thursday. It's your turn now. So what's it do for a female? I'll give you a hint. In order to reproduce, you've got to get close enough to do that. Yes? So what does the male have to do? Attract the female. Yes? Would secondary sex characteristics maybe help attract a female? Say yes. Good. So some of the hormones that also cause the maturation of gametes in males also produce secondary sex characteristics. It's basically to help attract a female, which is necessary for reproduction. So the book talks about effects of testosterone activity and male secondary sex characteristics on page 140. Okay? I don't want to forget to mention a hormone called Inhibin. And what's that doing for me? Do we want this constantly happening? Why? Males would explode, pretty much. Yes? So we have to have some way to do what? Yeah, slow down this process. So inhibin is a hormone that it slows down the process when we don't need to keep producing so many reproductive cells in the male's reproductive system. Any questions about males? We good? That's bugging the living day. You probably can't hear it back there. There's like a little chirping sound. It sounds like there's a bird caught in either that or it might be the heating system. I don't know. All right, so we good with males? Any questions about males and male reproductive system? What are all the parts for? What do they do? What is their role in preparing gametes for delivery to the female's reproductive system? Are we good? All right, now we're going to talk about the female's reproductive system. Again, female reproductive system, more of an internal, because what has to happen in the female's reproductive system? One, we have to make gametes just like males do because we have a contribution to make to a new organism. We have to contribute our 23 chromosomes to the new organism. But we get the privilege of doing what to that new organism? Housing it until it is ready to go out into the world. So we're also incubators as well. So in the female's reproductive system, along with the gamete producers, we're also going to talk about that place. And where is that place? It's called a uterus. It is not your stomach. Do not tell your children that you have this child in your stomach, because that might be a horror show if they understand what the stomach does. And they're like, why does she have that thing hanging out in a hydrochloric acid bath? Okay? So it is your uterus, not your stomach, where the child develops during a 40-week gestation period in females. And then we have a nice canal called the vagina that's going to help protect, giving us a barrier from the outside world for that developing embryo/fetus. Why do I keep calling it embryo/fetus? Do you know? Right. And it depends on your textbook, but about 2 months-ish, we stop calling the new developing organism an embryo, and we start calling it a fetus. Okay? So, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter. So, anatomy of the female's reproductive system. We have up here the place where our gametes are produced. Those are called ovaries. How many ovaries does a female have? 2, just like the males have 2 testes. Females have 2 sets of ovaries. Then after those cells are produced, and we don't make as many cells as the males do we? Because we don't have that far to travel with our cells. We don't have to overcome adverse environments. We're just going to keep our cells in our own environment. So females don't have to go through reproducing many gametes. As a matter of fact, how many gametes are we going to make normally a month? 1. That's it. 1. So we're going to go through the whole meiosis process and mitosis process just like we saw in the males, but we're not going to end up with 4 cells per maturing cell. We're going to end up with 1 cell. That process is called oogenesis, and we'll talk about that. So, after oogenesis has occurred, then the cell is going to get set free into a group of tubes called, does anybody know what these guys are called? These are called fallopian tubes. It's going to take a travel. The fallopian tube will then connect to the uterus. And then if fertilization takes place, do you know where it takes place? It actually takes place up here in the fallopian tubes, or the uterine tubes, same thing. And then that fertilized oocyte will then start to tumble down into the uterus, implant itself in the inner layer of the uterus, which is another job of the female. Every month, what does the female have to do? She's got to prepare the uterus for possible fertilization. Well, what's that mean? Well, think about a cell, and it's starting to reproduce. What do you think it needs in order to reproduce? Nutrients. And what's going to happen in mammals is the beginnings of that cell are going to implant themselves in a very highly vascular inner lining that's created every month, brand new, for possible fertilization. That inner lining is called the endometrium. And that's going to supply blood, nutrients, get rid of waste for those cells until they can produce their own connection to the parent that is fertilizing them. And does anybody know what that connection's called? In mammals, what's it called? It's called a placenta. And that's basically a vascular connection to mother. And that's where, as we develop further on during our cellular development as organisms, that's where we're then going to have nutrients given to us, and mother's going to take care of wastes for us during gestation. Again, how long is gestation in humans? 40 weeks. We're pretty long. Not the longest, though. Does anybody know who the longest is? Elephants. Guess how long? 2 years. Yeah, oh my goodness, is right. Those baby elephants better love their mothers carrying them around like that for 2 years. So right down to rodents. Anybody know what the gestation period is for a mouse? 21 days. And how many offspring do we typically give birth to? 1. Sometimes 2, rarely more than that. With the development of in vitro fertilization, all of these techniques to try and help couples who are having trouble with fertilization become fertile, we see more births, these multiples, these 8s, these 4s, these 6s. Those are not normal. Typically, human mammals do not naturally produce that many embryos. It's very, very, very rare because we're not built to house that many developing embryos. If we look at pigs, for example, they have a much longer uterus. So they're able to hold young in those uterus and give multiple births much easier. Dogs are the same way, for example. So they don't have a uterus like this. It kind of goes up both sides in animals like that. And that's why they're able to have so many in a litter normally. And their young tend to be very, very small compared to their adult size. Humans, on the other hand, have offspring that are pretty big compared to others in the mammal group. Okay? So, those are the parts. So what are the ovaries for? Yeah, this is where those immature cells are, and this is where, on a monthly basis, we will produce hormones to mature these gametes, just like we talked about during spermatogenesis. What are we calling it during the female's reproductive cycle? Oogenesis, because what is that cell that we are going to produce? It's not an egg. We always call it an egg. It's a oocyte. You can call it an egg, but know its proper name. It's called an oocyte. So during that month of maturation, we are going to take immature cells, which are housed in the ovaries. Females are born with all of their potential offspring. Are males? No. So females are born with these immature cells. They're called primary follicles that house these immature cells. And in the ovaries, we're going to go through a maturation process for these cells. And we're going to start to mature several of them every month. But, and today, this week in lab, I want you to pay close attention to this microscope slide on the ovary. What you're going to be looking for is something called the Graafian follicle. And the Graafian follicle is basically the winner of the race with respect to maturation of primary follicles during a monthly cycle in females. So several of these follicles are going to start to mature. Cells are going to undergo meiosis. We're going to produce eventually an oocyte. And one of them is typically going to do that faster than the others. That's your Graafian follicle. That's what I call the winner of the race. Sometimes it's a tie. And what may women do in a month? They might actually produce 2, maybe even 3 oocytes in a given month if, for some reason, the follicles are on the same track as they race for the end. Once that follicle ruptures, the others that are maturing will stop. So if for some reason I have a tie and I have more than one follicle that ruptures at the same time, I might produce more than one oocyte in a cycle. But again, it's rare. We're going to take turns. So one ovary will start the maturation process 1 month. The other ovary will do it the next month, and we'll switch off. So sometimes females have some problems with reproduction when both of their ovaries aren't functioning properly. So now, in order to produce an oocyte for potential fertilization, if you only have one ovary that's functioning properly, how many times can you get pregnant in a year? 6 instead of 12. There's only 12 times that you can get pregnant in a year. Yes? So 12 chances for fertilization. And guess what? There's 365 days in a year. What's your window for fertilization every month? Do you know how many days? 3 days. So your oocyte has potential for fertilization only 3 days during any given month. It's only viable for 24 hours, but guess what? Sperm's viable for longer. How long? 48 to 72 hours viability on sperm. So do you understand where the 3 days come in? So if there is sperm in the female's reproductive tract a day or two before the rupture of the oocyte takes place, that potentially can get fertilized. So that's where the 3 days come from. You all with me? Okay. So that's all the parts of the ovary. The next thing they talk about is the female's duct system. And when you look at the ovary, make sure you scan the whole thing under low power and then go. You can't miss it. The Graafian follicle. It's very, very large. As a matter of fact, we have a couple of slides where there's 2 oocytes in a Graafian follicle, which is pretty neat. That's, again, not typical. But what potentially, if fertilization takes place with this person, what potentially might that person end up with? Twins. Are they going to be identical twins? No. 2 different oocytes. Totally different people. What's an identical twin? Yeah, during those very beginnings, and we're talking about very beginnings of that cell, that one cell splitting, undergoing mitosis now after fertilization, something happens and they pull apart. So we're talking about at the 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 cell stage, something happens and they pull apart. But those cells are programmed to reproduce at a very fast rate until they reach a certain point where they are then going to differentiate. So when they pull apart at those very early stages, those cells are just going to keep reproducing themselves. So identical twins come from what? One fertilized oocyte. So they are genetically the same. See the difference? So make sure you look at that when you look at your slides in lab this week. All right, they talk about the female's duct system. Again, what we're going to see is an ovary where the oocyte matures and is released. Released where? It's basically released into fluid outside the ovary. Well, how does it make it into this duct system? Is this thing attached to the ovary? No, they're not attached. So how does that happen? Yep, see these little things on the end of the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes? They're called fimbria, little fingers. And guess what they do? They do this. They don't touch anything, they just do this. When I do this in fluid, what do you think I'm going to create? I'm going to create a wave. So that I basically, and now this is another thing that can happen during a monthly cycle, during the reproduction of the oocyte in the female's ovary, I can miss my target. So the fimbria, peristalsis-like motion, create waves in that fluid that cause the oocyte to go up into the fallopian or uterine tubes. Again, I might miss my target totally. So what's going to happen that month? Nothing. What's going to happen to the cell? It's only one cell. It's only going to be viable for 24 hours. What's going to happen to it after 24 hours? Yeah, it's going to die and be reabsorbed by the body. So we see areas of the duct system. The fallopian tube or uterine tube, the ampulla is the beginnings of that. And what do they describe the ampulla as? Or do they describe it in your book? Yep, they do. What do they describe it as? Yeah, believe it or not, if fertilization takes place, this is the area in which it typically takes place for a normal pregnancy. Usually down a little bit lower past the ampulla. Now, what has to happen? Deposit of sperm happens in this region. Where does sperm have to go? So deposit is here. It has to go through the cervical canal. Then where? Remember I talked about the long travel that the sperm had to take in the hostile environment of the female's reproductive tract? Where does the sperm have to travel? Up the uterus and up those fallopian tubes. And this is where fertilization typically takes place. Now what has to happen is that fertilized oocyte has to kind of tumble back down the tube. And where does it have to implant itself? In the endometrium of the uterus. Sometimes that goes wrong. And sometimes that fertilized oocyte, which is now starting to do what? Once fertilization takes place, what happens to that oocyte? Now I have 46 chromosomes. What can I do? I'm going to start to replicate. I'm going to replicate at a pretty fast rate. Remember, you come from one cell. How many cells do you have? Billions, yes? So that has to happen in 40 weeks in order for your new individual to occur. So cell mitosis is very rapid during the embryonic and fetal stage of humans. But sometimes, as that ball of cells, and we call it a blastula, you've heard that word before, right? You remember when you've heard that word before? Remember last semester in lab when we looked at whitefish blastula? Yeah, that was a whitefish's ball of cells. Remember I said, or hopefully your lab instructor told you, that each of the little dots on that slide was a potential whitefish until we grabbed them and sliced them up and threw them on a microscope slide. So that's a blastula, a ball of very rapidly reproducing cells. And sometimes that blastula gets stuck in the fallopian tubes. Can this continue? No. How come? Well, what happens in the uterus, and the uterus is the most amazing muscle in the human body, because that uterus, which, does anybody know what size the uterus is? How big your uterus is? About that big. Have you ever seen a child before? Right after it was born? Is it that big? No? What happens to this amazing muscle during the reproductive process? It's amazing how far it stretches. But it can do that. The fallopian tubes cannot. So what's going to happen as this cell keeps reproducing and getting larger and larger? Eventually it's going to cause the fallopian tubes to burst. So we have to stop that from happening by eliminating the developing oocyte or fertilized egg from the fallopian tubes. And that's called a tubal pregnancy. Has anybody ever experienced that or know somebody that's gone through that process? Yeah. And it can be very dangerous to the female because it can cause a great deal of hemorrhaging. So we have to, unfortunately, terminate that pregnancy and get that developing embryo out of there before it causes a rupture. So it has to implant in the endometrium in order to go through that 40-week gestation period and allow for the growth that's going to happen in that cell. So the next thing the book talks about then is the uterine wall itself. And the uterine wall, again, the most amazing muscle in the human body, consists of several different layers. The endometrium, and that's what we're going to talk about in a minute, that inner lining that you create basically every month once you become or hit the age where you can reproduce as a female. You start to make a brand new endometrium every month. And the endometrium is basically a very vascular layer that you produce fresh every month for possible fertilization. Underneath that, we have something called the myometrium. And the myometrium is what? Muscle. And this is the amazing muscle part. And then we have the perimetrium, which surrounds the myometrium. And this is what the wall of the uterus is made up of. So they talk about that under uterine wall in your textbook. The other diagram I want to look at quickly before we get, oh, that's your uterus, by the way. Kind of looks like a scary alien thing, but it's very small. This diagram shows us basically what we make when we create the endometrium on a monthly basis. And what we're creating is a layer that is very highly vascular that is going to help provide nutrients for the early stages of development until that developing embryo can do what? Create a vascular system that it then can use in the placenta to get its nutrients and get rid of wastes. So that's the endometrium. The next thing they talk about is the vaginal entrance in the female. And again, this is an internal system. So we want to make sure we have enough space to protect a developing embryo from the outside world. So the vaginal entrance is that space that we're giving to help protect a possible embryo / fetus from the outside world. We're also going to find in that area, what else? We have two separate entrances in females, but in that same region we're going to find the urethral orifice as well. So we have the vaginal entrance and the urethral orifice in that same region. But they, remember, are two separate entrances into or out of the female's body. So that's what's a little bit different about the female's reproductive system. What else does a female have that is necessary and part of sort of accessory organ to the female's reproductive system? What are these guys? Mammary glands. And what are they for? Yeah, to provide nutrients for an infant when it is born. So that's another job of mother, to provide nutrients for the early stages of an infant's life. So mammary glands are structures that will produce mother's milk to provide nutrients for a developing or after development infant once it is born. They talk a little bit about problems. And what is this problem? This is why women, it's very important for you to go and make sure you do what? Every year. Have a breast exam, and once you hit 40, what are you going to have every year? Mammograms, to detect any malignancies or problems that might develop, because this is very vascular tissue and constantly going through hormonal changes which are secondarily affected by the hormones that help with the maturation process in the ovaries. We're highly susceptible to forming tumors. So breast cancer is something that we're seeing definite increases in our society through the years. So it's very important for you to go and make sure you have your mammograms every year after you hit 40. So what is this? Yep, this is the cellular reproduction process that's going on in the ovaries, the female's reproductive tract. And we are producing from a primary or primordial follicle or primary follicle, we are producing what? Yeah, one oocyte. So this is the process of meiosis in females. We're going to do the exact same thing. We have immature cells, the oogonium or stem cells, that are going to start going through the mitosis process. And then we're going to produce something called a primary oocyte. And the primary oocyte is in the primordial follicles. Now, before birth, believe it or not, females will start doing this. And during infancy and childhood, this is when we're going to prepare those primary oocytes housed in those primordial follicles. So this process, does everybody understand that? This process takes place before you're even born as a female. In infancy and childhood, we're going to prepare those primordial follicles. And then once I reach puberty, all the way through menopause, so beginning to end of my reproductive life, I am then going to mature those primordial follicles into primary follicles, which we see in our diagram. You with me? So before your reproductive life starts, you have primordial follicles waiting for the maturation process. Once you hit puberty, and that's the time in which you make all of the hormones we're going to talk about at the proper level to start this process going, you are then going to produce those primary follicles, which you will then mature on a monthly basis from puberty to menopause. Everybody with me? So in females, we start this process even before we're born, getting these cells ready for our reproductive years. So primary oocytes are kind of arrested in prophase 1 until that time of the month comes. And that time of the month is going to involve hormones, which will then come in contact with their target. And in the case of the female's reproductive system, the target is those primary follicles, which will then start to do what? They're going to start to mature into secondary follicles and eventually the Graafian follicles. So within those follicles, what's happening when they come in contact with hormones that are going to stimulate their maturation is we're starting to kick in that meiosis process. So we're going to finish up the meiosis divisions, but in the case of females' reproductive system, if we look down here at the bottom of the diagram, what we're going to produce is one mature oocyte or ovum, and then the other portions that should have been, and in males they are reproductive cells, we produce sort of incomplete portions of cells. We call them polar bodies, which are just basically absorbed back into the female's reproductive system. So the first polar body is produced after meiosis 1. Again, hormones are going to play a role in this maturation process. And this secondary oocyte is what is going to end up eventually being the mature ovum or oocyte that we are going to release from the Graafian follicle during the ovulation process. So basically ovulation is the release of that mature oocyte into the fluid around the ovary, and then we have to go through all of that other good stuff. Okay? So by the end of meiosis 2, what are we going to end up with? One ovum and what? And 3 polar bodies. And again, they're just fragments of incomplete type cells that we're basically going to break down and reabsorb into the female's system. So is everybody good with the whole maturation process in females? So what's the difference between spermatogenesis and oogenesis? Yeah, in oogenesis, I'm only going to have 1 mature ovum. In spermatogenesis, I'm going to have 4 mature spermatid. And remember, ovum and spermatid are going to have what as far as genetics go? Half the genetic material as that stem cell had in the beginning. So that's the difference between meiosis and mitosis. The end product is going to have half the genetic material as the beginning stem cell. It's going to be N, not 2N. Everybody understand what N and 2N means? Yes? Okay. So, now, the follicular phase is what the book talks about next in the ovarian cycle. And this is an awesome group of pictures on page 1051 that shows us microscopically what's happening during that maturation process. So it outlines everything for you. The primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle. And we can see that maturation process here. And this is now what we call a primary follicle. This is the one that is going to do what? Probably. There's more than just one of these being produced during any given cycle, though. But this primary follicle will eventually become a Graafian follicle. Again, there's a couple of them going on at this time. So that primary follicle is going to start to mature and become what? It's nice the way they name these, the secondary follicle, where what's going to happen to that mature oocyte in the middle eventually, once it's finished its whole mitosis and meiosis process, it's going to be protected by a zone of cells. And what do you think that's for? I kind of said it in my description. It's for protection of the genetic material that we find in that. Ooh, in that follicle that's being matured. So primary follicle becomes a secondary follicle. It's going to continue maturing into a late secondary follicle, and now we're going to start to see that group of cells that are going to protect the internal workings of that oocyte during the maturation process in the late secondary follicle. Why does that keep happening? Who's next? So now we're going to start to see something that looks very, very close to our Graafian follicle. Mature vesicular follicles carry out meiosis 1, and ovulation is about to occur. Again, ovulation is the release of the secondary oocyte that is protected by a group of cells called the what? It's called the corona radiata. And that group of cells is going to protect that cell during its travels down the fallopian tubes. Rupture of the follicle in step 6 releases the secondary oocyte, and ovulation has occurred. So, understand those steps. Yes? The next stage they talk about is something called the luteal phase. And the luteal phase involves preparing for possible fertilization and implantation. And one of the things that is going to help during the luteal phase is that Graafian follicle that gets left behind. There's cells that are actually going to produce hormones that are going to help with possible fertilization and implantation. And those cells that are left behind are going to work for a few days after the Graafian follicle has released the secondary oocyte. That group of cells that's left is called the corpus luteum, luteal phase. And they are going to produce hormones during this phase. And anybody know what the hormones are called? Who? Nope. Yep. Estrogen and progesterone. And that corpus luteum, if pregnancy does not occur, will start to degrade after a few days. So, if pregnancy occurs, it's going to help with implantation. So those hormones are very important in the whole process of reproduction. So, who's going to get this whole ball rolling? Just like in the males, who's responsible? Same kind of hormones. And remember when we discussed the endocrine system, we met these hormones. And they talked about females and males producing many of these hormones. So the same types of hormones that got cells maturing in the male's reproductive tract are also going to be released in the female's reproductive tract. So we have gonadotropic releasing hormone causing the release from the what pituitary gland? Anterior pituitary gland of? What are the hormones released from the anterior pituitary gland? Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. They're going to have an effect on metabolism and maturation in the, we're talking females, ovaries of the female, so they're going to get those cells starting to mature in the primary follicles now. These hormones are called androgens. And eventually we are going to have maturation of the primary follicle into the Graafian follicle, and ovulation due to a surge of hormones right near the end of maturation. Luteinizing hormone surges are going to help with the ovulation process. And then as the corpus luteum does its thing, that's the thing that's going to slow the whole hormone release down. So an increase in progesterone and estrogen, and another hormone that is produced by the corpus luteum called inhibin. Did we hear that before? In males, exactly. So we make kind of the same hormones, yes? That is going to slow this process down until it's time to do the whole thing again next month. So this happens very regularly in females. And this diagram on page 1055 is the correlation of anterior pituitary and ovarian hormones with structural changes of the ovary and the uterus. I wish I had it all in one because it makes sense more when you look at the whole thing together. But we see different hormone levels peaking at different times during a female's cycle. So in your textbook, the description starts with hormonal interaction during the ovarian cycle on page 1053 and continues on through 1054. So it talks about gonadotropic releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, the negative feedback and positive feedback mechanisms, a luteinizing hormone surge, ovulation occurring, the corpus luteum, and negative feedback to kind of stop the whole cycle from going. So that's a nice written description of what we just talked about in class. So this diagram is going to help us understand the uterine or menstrual cycle. So what the effects of all those hormones at different times during a female's cycle. And this cycle typically takes place, how long does it happen? How long does it take to take place? Having difficulty talking. How many days-ish? 28 days. So this cycle is a 28-day cycle. The maturation from a primary follicle to an oocyte or mature ovum takes 28 days to happen. And during that time, we're going to have a fluctuation in hormones that are going to cause that to occur. So you need to understand the uterine or menstrual cycle and what happens during the different days of that cycle. So the menstrual phase happens between day 1 and 5 during this cycle. And I'm going to skip ahead and go down to the bottom, actually. So each of these phases, the menstrual phase, proliferative phase, and the secretory phase, are going to produce different things during the female's maturation of a mature ovum. I want you to have a look at what happens to the endometrium, and that's what this last diagram shows us. So during the menstrual phase, what's going on? What am I doing? That's the beginning. Day 1 is the day you get rid of the old and start the new. If fertilization and implantation does not take place after ovulation, I'm going to start the whole process over again as a female. And that begins with me getting rid of the old layer that I produced for a month. So in 28 days, I'm going to produce a brand new endometrial layer. If I'm not using it at the end of those 28 days, I'm going to get rid of it and start the whole phase again. So day 1 starts with getting rid of the old layer, and that's called the menstrual phase. And typically 5 to 7 days to get rid of the old layer is what happens in females. What's next? Between day 6 and day 14, I'm going to start to build a new layer. And during that time, and what's that time called? That's called the proliferative phase. And during that time, what else am I going to do? Or what else is happening? Come on, girls. Nobody knows what happens during the proliferative phase? Huh? Yeah, so what do you think I'm doing during the proliferative phase if I ovulate at the end of it? Yeah, I'm also going to start Maturing my oocyte. Thank you very much. So we're going to go through that whole process of cellular division and the formation of the Graafian follicle during that proliferative phase as well. We actually start doing it a little bit before that during the menstrual phase, but mostly happens during the proliferative phase as well. So while I'm maturing that cell, getting ready for ovulation and ready for possible fertilization and implantation, I am creating a very vascular endometrial lining. And that happens between day 6 and day 14, and it's called the proliferative phase. At the end of that phase, what am I going to do? Just before I've built that wall perfectly, that I'm prepared for fertilization for, what's going to happen around day 14? I'm going to release the oocyte. What's that called? Ovulation. So about day 14 in the cycle is when ovulation takes place. Is this like this way for every single female? Yeah, no. So day 6 to 14 is a proliferative or pre-ovulatory phase. Day 15 to 28 is the secretory phase or the post-ovulatory phase. And what happens between day 15 and 28 is I'm going to perfect that endometrium. Because what might possibly happen between day 15 and 28? Fertilization might take place way up in the fallopian or uterine tubes, and we have to give it a few days to do what? Travel down, and we have to have some sort of attraction to that uterine wall. So we're going to secrete different substances with the formation of something called endometrial glands that are going to provide a nice sticky substance for that possible fertilized oocyte to stick to the endometrial wall. And that's going to happen during the secretory phase or the post-ovulatory phase of a female's menstrual cycle. Or we don't call it a menstrual cycle. What are we calling it? Well, they do call it a menstrual cycle. That's kind of misleading. I'd rather you call it a uterine cycle, because menstruation, the menstrual phase, is done after day 5. Okay? So, if fertilization takes place, implantation should take place at that peak time. And give me a day. What's that peak time where the wall is just right? Between what day and what day? Take a guess. Look at the picture. Between day 20 and 25. See? Perfect. So what happens if implantation doesn't take place? After day 25, what's going to start happening to that endometrial wall? It's going to start to degrade. It's going to start to shrivel up. And when I hit day 28, as it starts to kind of shrink up on itself, what's going to happen to it? It's going to start to tear away from the myometrium. And guess what happens on day 1 again? Yeah, we start to get rid of the old and start the new. What happens to that cell that never got fertilized or implanted? That's going to leave the female's reproductive tract. So it's going to keep falling out of the female's reproductive tract, and you won't even notice it's gone. It's only one little cell. And we're going to start the whole process over again. So understand what goes on during the uterine cycle. This diagram is going to help you understand what's going on as far as the endometrium goes. We're going to go back up. We're going to work our way up. So what hormones then are going to help with the maturation of that endometrium along with the maturation of the oocyte itself? Well, first of all, let's go way back up with luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And this is one of the reasons why women can get a little testy during this whole maturation process. Do you see what happens to plasma hormone levels during this maturation process, just before ovulation, that's a huge spike. Yes? Luteinizing hormone spike is going to cause ovulation, but follicle stimulating hormone goes up pretty high as well. This can cause some problems in women with what? Moods, emotions. Hormone spikes like that can cause problems with emotions. Some women are affected much greater by these spikes in hormone levels than other women. But it is a physiological phenomenon, sorry guys, but these hormone levels going this high can cause some serious problems with women's metabolism. So fluctuation of, oh, where'd that go? No, that's not the end. Fluctuation of gonadotropic hormones, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, its relation to some of the different phases that are going on in the ovaries. And that's what this portion of the diagram shows us with respect to fluctuation in the hormones, what's happening in the ovaries. So we're going from primary follicle to secondary follicle to vesicular follicle to the ovulation point at day 14. An ovulation point is going to occur because of a spike in who? Big spike in who? Luteinizing hormone. Remember, follicle stimulating is also going to get pretty high there as well. And then the corpus luteum producing that progesterone and estrogen and inhibin. And then if, well, this happens anyway. If fertilization takes place, great. If it doesn't happen, this is still going to occur, but what's going to happen to that corpus luteum after a few days? It's going to start to degrade as well and produce something called, what's it? No. I'm trying to figure out what diagram it's in. Did they show it? What happens to that shriveled up corpus luteum? They call it something. Begins with an A. I'm trying to find what page it is for you. What page is it on? 1051. It's called the Corpus Albicans anyway. I don't see it. Oh, I'm looking on the wrong page. That's why I don't see it. Oh, there it is. So which identifies the Corpus Albicans. Corpus Albicans is basically a shriveled up corpus luteum, which is kind of like scar tissue. So what happens, women have many, many more primary follicles than they're ever going to use in their reproductive life. And they'll hit a point where they're going to have trouble with this whole process of maturation of the oocyte because of scar tissue that forms over many, many years of going through this process every single month in the ovaries. So that corpus albicans is basically like scar tissue. Yeah, it just sits there. So what's going to happen after many years of going through this every single month? Eventually this whole process is going to stop working. So even though we produce the hormones, we're not going to be able to mature because of all the scar tissue that builds up in the ovaries through the years. We're not going to be able to create that nice mature corpus luteum. And what's that stage of a woman's life called? It's called menopause. Why do they call it menopause? No, we don't start being a man. Huh? You cease the years of menses. That's why they call it menopause. So, one of the problems with that stage of a woman's life is some of the secondary sex characteristics and other effects of some of the hormones that are produced by who? the corpus luteum. So if I can't make a nice mature corpus luteum worth of cells, I'm going to start decreasing my production of some of the hormones associated with that nice mature corpus luteum. Again, estrogen and progesterone. So the effects of estrogen and progesterone are not only for the maturation of that nice endometrial layer and possible fertilization, but they are also responsible for some of women's what? Yeah, secondary sex characteristics. Okay? So during menstrual cycle, we also have fluctuations in ovarian hormones like estrogen and progesterone during this uterine cycle, which are produced by the corpus luteum and cause changes in the endometrial layers. High estrogen levels are also responsible for the surge in LH and FSH, excuse me. So these fluctuations of hormones are also responsible for secondary sex characteristics as well. So on page 1057, we see a summary of hormonal effects of gonadal estrogens, progesterones, and testosterones. So what are they for? Well, estrogens, ovary development. They're going to help stimulate the release of FSH and LH. But what else? Bone growth. Promote long bone growth. And what? Can everybody see that in the table? Who has a book? Yep. Feminization of the skeleton. I'm going to go past the baby. Where are we? Do I have the table in here? So what happens, bottom line, what happens when a woman starts decreasing their production in estrogen? It's responsible for secondary sex characteristics, but it's also responsible for what? Yeah. And this is where I'm referring to in that table 27.1. Long bone growth and feminization of the skeleton, particularly the pelvis, inhibits bone reabsorption and then stimulates epiphyseal closure, promotes hydration of the skin, and female pattern of fat deposits. So when I start decreasing my production of some of these hormones in menopause, what can start to happen to me? And this is where I have to be very careful about my bones. I can start to increase bone loss and develop what? Osteoporosis. So a lot of supplements, you can get prescriptions for some of these supplements as well. That's what their goal is, to prevent you from going through that. Yes? Yes. Yes. So, very good point. You're stopping normal production of these hormones by taking a medication that does that. So you have to make sure you're very careful. Make sure you take calcium supplements. And it's important, if you're going to take a calcium supplement, make sure that calcium supplement has what in it? Vitamin D for proper absorption. Also, if you suffer from acid reflux disease, you have to be careful what supplements you take. Did you know that? Women, if you take calcium supplements and you also take proton pump inhibitors like Prevacid or Nexium or any of those other guys, be careful of which supplement you take. There's one that's very popular on the market. It's called Caltrate. You can't take that. Yeah. You know which one you have to take instead? Citracal. Same company, different mechanism of absorption. So you have to be educated. Educate yourself. If you are lowering your production of these hormones and you know the effects of a decreased production of these hormones, You have to take extra care to make sure that you don't go through this. So, Citracal, for those of you who have stomach problems, Caltrate's a good one. There's a bunch of different products on the market. Those nice little chewy things that taste like candy, they're very good. But you can't really take those if you have acid reflux disease, so be careful. So know the effects of estrogen and progesterone. Testosterone, again in that list, is going to stimulate the growth spurt of hair. It's also going to affect skeletal formation as well. Promote vocal cord deepening of voice, enhances sebum secretion, hair growth, especially on the face, the axillary region, the genital region, and the chest. Okay, so those are male secondary sex characteristics. Do females produce testosterone? Yes, we do. It's a precursor to some of our hormones too. So with the decrease of estrogens and progesterones, what's another thing that females might start to encounter? Yes. So those are things you have to look forward to during the menstrual stage of your life. Sorry, ladies. So, understand the effects of estrogen and progesterone. Sexually transmitted infections. What are some of the popular sexually transmitted infections? Not very popular if you have them, but know a general definition for. And sexually transmitted infections are shared by sexual intercourse. Not necessarily male and female. Males can share them with males. Sorry. But, so, sexual intercourse is going to transfer these nasty little critters from one person to another. Gonorrhea is a bacterial invader. Syphilis, trichomonas, genital warts, herpes, and they didn't put this one up there, but it's probably the worst of all. HIV. Is it there? Oh, there it is. Okay. So that's also a sexually transmitted disease. So general definition of those as well. Developmental aspects, don't worry about it, and we are done. Oh, they also talk about puberty and menopause. 1063 is where that discussion starts there too. So that can help you understand, again, you're basically having matured enough during your development to start producing these hormones at high enough a level to get you going in the maturation stage of your cells. Okay, so we are going to pick up then with pregnancy and human development on Thursday. No more quizzes, but I had a suggestion that maybe I would really like quizzes. And like I said, I don't want to grade them anymore. So I've already established your grade for your clicker quizzes. I sent someone an email. Can't remember who it was. I think it was you. I don't have your number. Got to give me your number of your clicker, because I have a number and it's not associated with your name. So I'm guessing it's yours. So what I'm going to do then is throw up a bunch of questions at the beginning of class on Thursday from Fluid and Electrolyte chapter and this chapter, Reproductive. I'm not going to grade them, but I'm just going to throw them up there so you can get some practice. So that's what I'll do. Is that good? So that'll give you some feedback, and I won't have to grade them.